The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Thanks for coming out tonight, everybody. I love to have you here. Ailanthus is a novelist, blogger, and freelance writer and editor. Most of her work revolves around science somehow, even her fiction. She's the author of 3 novels, as well as various blogs, short stories, and essays. Carolyn?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. This place is incredibly fancy. And I'm so glad you all showed up. You can't give a talk without an audience. It doesn't work. It's a rule. So I'm here to talk about my latest book, Bifurcation Events. The best way to introduce a book is to read the blurb on the back. That's why the blurbs are so hard to write, by the way. If you ever want to be a really stressed out novelist, write your own blurb. It's just... but we persevere, so I have a blurb. There are moments that divide life into before and after. Death can do it. Any disaster can. But so can miracles, so can love. Andy, a scientist, calls these moments bifurcation events, a technical term that he may or may not mean literally. He's seen his share, most dramatically in the complete collapse of the civilization of his youth, and the beginning of another. His story, or part of it, was told in the novel Ecological Memory. That's here. Here are the related stories of some of his family and friends. So yeah, this is a sequel, but it's a standalone sequel, same world, some of the same characters, but you don't have to read the other one first for this one to make sense. This is actually not, it says a novel by on top, but it's not a singular novel. It's what I call a collection of short-ish fiction. 5 short stories, 2 novellas, and 1 small novel, all packaged together. And they share most of their characters and the same fictional world. But what really draws them all together is the theme of the bifurcation event. A bifurcation event, it is a technical term. It is a radical change that can't be predicted from prior conditions alone. So, all of us have been through these biologically. We start out as these little balls of undifferentiated cells, and then all of a sudden we fold in on ourselves and, become much more complex very quick. And if you didn't know that was going to happen, you just think it would be a ball of cells forever and maybe get bigger. But now that we know that it happens, these are not events that happen out of the blue for no reason. In our lives, these things happen. You're living your life and things are going along and you kind of think that everything's going to keep going that way, or, maybe get better or maybe get worse, depending on how you think about things. But what happened in the past is going to basically be what continues to happen, right? It's the same trajectory, and then you get something comes out of nowhere, apparently, and everything changes. And you just have to deal with it. When I started writing this book, I didn't know what it was about. I knew the stories that I wanted to tell and the characters I wanted to pay attention to and so forth. But I didn't know I didn't know why I was writing it other than curiosity about what happens next. I got near the end and realized that that was the unifying theme, this bifurcation event, and that, you know, we all go through these moments that change everything. And I'd been through several. I mean, you know, we all had these COVID and other things, and I wanted to know what you do. What do you do when the world is suddenly not like what you expected it to be, when your story changes? And like most writers, when I have a question, I write about it. Anyway, so I should get on to the reading part of the program and give you some examples. I'll start with the first story in the collection. It's the shortest, so I'll just read the whole story for you. This is called A Cold, Uncertain Dawn. Elsie woke to cold, the scent of cold, of snow, of tent fabric. The coldness felt good on her hot skin. Confusion. She wasn't in her room? The child fell asleep again before she could figure it out. Nothing seemed worth thinking through. Her head hurt, her chest hurt, her tummy hurt. Her breath wouldn't come right. She slept again. She woke. Daddy feeding her soup. It tasted funny. Daddy had put something in it to make her feel better. Try to have some, he said. You have to stay hydrated. Where's Jamie? Shh, said Daddy. Consciousness came and went. She snuggled down under the blankets in her sleeping bag, shivering, then struggled out of her bag and threw off the blankets, burning up. In the daytime, the walls were luminous. She was in a tent. She kept forgetting that. To poo, she had to go outside and squat in the snow. She always had to poo. Her butt hurt. Her breath, reflected back at her face from the inside of her sleeping bag, burned her eyes. She had a moment of clarity, of fledgling analysis. I have a fever, so my breath is too hot for my eyes. And my sleeping bag is wet because I'm sweating even though I feel cold. It's because I have a fever. But mostly she couldn't think much. Then she had to go poo again. There had been other people. When she was awake enough to think through anything, she could remember that. The camping trip, not to either of the campgrounds, Blackwoods or Seawall, but to a spot way up in the woods they had to hike to, carrying all their stuff, so much stuff, all of it heavy uphill through the snow, with Daddy and Jamie and those two women who were Daddy's friends, and their kid, who was Elsie's own age, but seemed sort of shy or maybe stuck up and then started coughing and turned blotchy. I'm going to remember this for show and tell when we get back to school, Elsie had said. We're not going back, Jamie had told her. You don't know anything. She hated it when he got that superior tone, just because he was older, but he was right. She hardly knew anything, and that was almost okay, because he would explain it all to her eventually. He always did. But then everybody got sick, spotted and blotchy, and the others went into separate tents or something, because they weren't around anymore, and everything got confusing, and Elsie couldn't think right or breathe right, and now she had to go poo again. Daddy? Daddy had been gone a long time. She went to sleep while he wasn't in the tent, and when she woke up, he still wasn't there. Daddy? When he got back, he looked tired and sad and sort of gray in the face. He sat down on the sleeping pad, just like he used to sit on the edge of her bed back at home. He asked all his questions. Are you warm, cold, hungry, thirsty? How's your tummy? He felt her forehead, asked her to breathe deep so he could listen. This time when she breathed, she didn't cough. The breathing still hurt. She didn't really feel like talking. She sort of fell asleep, but not really. Nothing much was really anything these days. She lay there, sort of sleeping, but not really, and Daddy rubbed her ears so she would feel a little better. After a while, Daddy spoke. It's just you and me now, kid, he said. But don't worry, I can take care of us. We have plenty of food, plenty of ammunition. I know lots of wild plants we can eat, and there's deer here. We can have a garden, too. You'll like having a garden. There's fish in the lake. I can teach you to fly fish. How about that? No one will find us. We'll be safe here. Don't worry. But there's one thing I need you to do for me. Elsie, Elsita, Elsie girl. I need you to just not die. Not now. Because I need to have somebody to care for. I can't do this alone. The inside of the tent smelled cold and musty, and the daylight through the tent walls was starting to fade. Elsie never afterwards remembered him saying that, but for the rest of her life, when she thought about those weeks in the tent while one world, one life ended, and something else began, she wondered if just something just like that had been said. Let me find my notes. Yeah. But these events, they're not always sad, or not only sad anyway. Let me give you another example. This one is from the beginning of another story, first few paragraphs. In case it's not obvious from the beginning, this is set several decades after the one I just read you. It's called I'll Be Seeing You. There are too many people in this room, Elsie whispered. 400 some sat around and behind her, most of them talking loudly. Since moving to the cabin in the woods, she'd started forgetting how to deal with strangers. You have never seen a train station in Mumbai, Diana, her traveling companion replied, amused. I'm glad I haven't. But she'd come to this conference to network. How is she supposed to meet people if the people had her out of sorts? Until she just did it, without thinking. I like your hair, she told the stranger to her right. Do you really? If I were going to start buttering people up, Elsie said, why would I start with you? I don't know you from Eve. The woman threw back her head and laughed. She was tall, slim, slightly angular. Her hair, very short, very straight, was salt with a little pepper and a generous but irregular splash of purple. The cowl is new, she explained slowly, thoughtfully, lightly. I wanted to make my hair match it, but the shade didn't come out right. The cowl, along with a black or brown tunic, and trousers or a skirt, was professional dress these days. Everyone in the room wore one, usually tipped back off the head and spread across the shoulders. The cowl's colors and pattern identified the user's guild. But Elsie didn't recognize this woman's soft shades of gray, blue, and purple. Quite elegant, although, no, the purples didn't match. The woman wore a senior guild member pin on her chest, a small silver ankh in the cartilage of her left ear, and a gold wedding band on the ring finger of her right hand. How did you do it? Elsie asked. Blackberry juice. Really, I'd have eaten the blackberries. Well, I'd have eaten them too, except... And the woman paused thoughtfully for so long that she didn't get to finish before a young man wearing a black and green cowl took the stage and called the first session to order. There hadn't been a conference like this since before the collapse, 26 years ago. Maybe there had never been one. After all, before, environmentalists of all stripes had been playing defense, fighting a long retreat. The old way of life would itself end. That was inevitable. That's what unsustainable means. But how much of the world would be destroyed first? Conservation scientists met to discuss how much could be saved and for how long. They wanted the end to come soon, but deliberately, gently, justly. Instead, the pandemic struck, and while too many people lay sick at once, the convoluted supply chains made possible, actually economically inevitable, by fossil fuel failed, and 5 billion people starved. The survivors, grieving, terrified, rebuilt on a different basis and left fossil fuel and its promises and risks behind. And the world began to green. Now, a generation later, professional scientists and educators and so forth gathered again, but the questions they were asking had changed. These people and the others attending similar conferences elsewhere wanted to know not how can we slow decline, but how do we aid recovery? But however exciting the conference as a whole, the first session was boring, introductory, bureaucratic, and seemingly interminable. When it finally ended, a mass exodus towards the toilets began. Elsie caught at the sleeve of the purple-haired woman, asking, "Except what?" The question was pointless. Nobody could remember an interrupted thought that long. Anybody would look at Elsie oddly, even for asking. But the woman did not look at her oddly. "Except there is a sense in which something other than the body needs to be fed," she explained. "The spirit hungers for beauty. or silly hair, or something. She smiled and turned to go, but stopped when a voice called Elsie's name. This disease they're talking about, by the way, it's the same disease that formed the backdrop of ecological memory, which is set 20 years after a global pandemic basically crashes civilization. Not that everybody dies, but everybody's sick at the same time, and so not enough people can go to work to keep the whole thing going, and it crashes. The funny thing is, I wrote memory before COVID happened. And then a couple months later, I wrote a book about a global pandemic, and then we had one. I had friends calling me up and saying, hey, can your book not come true? And I'm like, yeah. I don't have any control over this.
Just stop manifesting.
Exactly. Now I'm writing a book about a civil war.
Please stop.
You might want to wait on that.
Anyway, there were so I had to guess about a lot of things because, I had nothing to work from. And some of my guesses were really good, which I don't take credit for that. There are people who study these sorts of things, and I did a bunch of research, and their guesses were really good. I just, what they said, and anyway. But then there were things that I didn't get. I overestimated the degree to which people would be awful to each other, and that happened a little, but not to the same extent. I underestimated kindness. People were good to each other in a way they aren't normally. There was this quietness that I live in a rural area. It's not like there's a lot of noise there anyway, but it was quiet in a way. So when I went to write this book, I didn't retcon anything. I didn't go back and, everything about the world that I'd established in the first book is still in this one, which means this book is now written about a future that doesn't contain COVID. It contains this other thing. But I added things. I added what I'd learned. And so I want to read you a passage. This is from in the middle of one of the novellas. Just to let you know, this character, Luke, he's French-Canadian. He's living in Montreal, and he is a recovering addict. And he is recently bereaved. Nothing much mattered to Luke after that. He watched the news mechanically. There were international efforts at developing a vaccine, a test, some kind of treatment. It all seemed very optimistic, except nobody was confident that any of that could be ready in time for widespread use. There were huge gaps on store shelves, supply chain problems, they said, exacerbated by panicked hoarding. There were online black markets in toilet paper, hand sanitizer, macaroni, duct tape. Duct tape? Why duct tape? Nothing made sense. The United States began a cold shutdown of all of its nuclear reactors and all of its refineries and any other facilities that might cause problems if abandoned. Canada followed suit. Other countries were doing similar things. The implications were plain, but nobody said it out loud. Luke didn't much care either way. His children were dead. His mother died, and suddenly he could care again, care about everything, but in a strange, exhausted, shell-shocked way. Maman had survived the disease, but supply chain problems included medications. She was diabetic and had a weak heart. Her funeral was simply put off. It was that or mass graves these days. Bodies filled refrigerator trucks parked in rows near hospital morgues. Days went slowly, but weeks went fast. There was no time to respond to one disaster before the next arrived. Supposedly wearing masks would help slow transmission, and people who happened to have them wore them, but there weren't enough, and there was no time to make enough. Sewing circles and factories alike retooled and started making protective equipment, but the fruits of their labor went to hospitals and nursing homes, and still doctors and nurses had to reuse the few masks they had. There was no question of protection for the man on the street. The electrical grid grew erratic. There were new faces reporting the news as the anchors sickened or left to care for the sick, and were replaced on air by producers and interns. Riots spread throughout the United States. The politics there had been becoming increasingly volatile in recent years, and now it seemed no one trusted anyone. That contagion, too, seemed likely to enter Canada. Francine went missing. Then Andy, Philippe's other boy, the smart one, went missing. Some tired-sounding official called in the middle of the night saying something about Philippe, and Luke just about went ape on her until he realized what she was saying was true. Philippe was dead, apparently mugged for the gasoline in his car. Luke, now, for the first time in his life, had no brothers. He did not seriously contemplate drinking or screwing. Nothing is so bad that a slip won't make it worse, as they say. But he called up Michelle to ask why he shouldn't commit suicide. You mean, aside from the going to hell bit? Yeah, aside from that. Well, it's wrong. That's the reason for the going to hell bit. I know, but why? We're going to die soon anyway, right? There's no coming back from this. You don't know that. You don't know what God has planned for you. Anyway, even if you do die soon, maybe you can let him use your death for something good. What? I don't know. People died at home waiting for ambulances. They died in parked ambulances waiting outside overfilled emergency rooms. They died in gurneys on the hallways of hospitals. The increasingly spotty and amateurish news coverage was full of such stories. There was no free beds at the hospitals, no available ventilators, and never enough staff because doctors and nurses were becoming patients or committing suicide. During shift changes at the hospitals, the neighbors would lean out their windows and clap and cheer, throw handmade greeting cards or sometimes roses. All through the city at dusk, people would lean out their windows and sing, and sing. Birthdays and wedding anniversaries and deaths were acknowledged by chalk drawings in the street. Nobody ever saw the artists, only the art. There were no planes in the sky anymore. Only clouds, only birds, only stars. Luke, walking home one day from the grocery, you no longer went in. You handed a list to an employee and waited until they returned with full shopping bags and a miniature credit card reader. Nobody was taking cash. He varied his route, making his way through a lovely upscale neighborhood where he'd never been before. The streets here had not yet been plowed, though the last snow was 3 days ago. He almost didn't notice the anomaly, so common had such lapses become. He was picking his way through an icy patch when, from above him on a balcony, came notes played on a cello, familiar notes. Luke stopped and looked up, trying to spot the performer. He could not. The angle was bad, but while he searched, another performer, this one on trumpet, joined in from another balcony. Then another on guitar and another on violin. All around him, musicians, some talented, some otherwise, rushed to grab their instruments and join in. They were all playing Leonard Cohen's Alleluia. When the song finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the invisible cellist started again, the same song, presumably to give the others a chance to play it from the beginning. Only this time the cellist also sang, and suddenly voice after voice lifted. The entire neighborhood appeared to consist of Leonard Cohen fans. They all knew all the words, the voices of people through open wintry windows, voices of people whom Luke did not know and mostly could not see. Luke knew the lyrics too, and he joined in, whispering along at first, then singing loudly, not caring for the moment about whether his voice might be good enough. He too had been undone by moonlight. He'd paced floors, he'd lived alone, and he expected no victory march, not for himself, not for anyone else, not anymore. He sang, and he felt himself heard. A baffled and a broken king alone in an empty snow-plowed street crying, Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia. In his voice it became an accusation. It became a plea, a question for which he heard no answer. It became his praise of God. I like Luke. He is not someone I want to know in real life, as you'll find out when you read the rest of the story. But as his author, I like Luke. The longest story in the book, the novel. Sometimes my mouth does not obey my brain. You know how that happens? Usually it's cooperative, but not always. The novel is most directly a sequel of Ecological Memory. So if you have read that one, then you get to find out what Andy and Elsie have been doing since then. And what they've been doing is studying history. Ecological memory, as the name implies, is they're studying ecology, and now, got into history. And that was kind of accidental on my part. I have a scientific background. I am a life sciences buff. All that's very much my thing. History less so. But the thing is, you ever been to Mount Desert Island in Maine? Mm-hmm. Oh, good, excellent. That's actually taken from the map of Long Pond. Mm-hmm. If you've been there, the trails and so forth around it. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to attend a graduate level field studies course on Mount Desert Island with this amazing naturalist, Tom Wessels. If you get a chance to read Tom's books, do it. He is a treasure. And so I got to take this course with him. And I'd been to Mount Desert Island a couple of times before. My husband and I actually honeymooned there. And I developed this recurring dream. It wasn't, my version of it was not a nightmare, but there was some anxiety about it, about being on an island, particularly Mount Desert Island. And there's a forest fire, and being in this forest fire and looking through the trees at the water and trying to find a boat so I could get off the island, and there were no boats. So it was the first day of the course. I mentioned to Tom about this dream that I had, and he said, that's really interesting because that really happened. And he told me about the Bar Harbor fire of 1947. If you have heard of it. And it turned out that the class was a lot about that, so I ended up learning a lot about it. And I still to this, I haven't had the dream in a long time, and I don't know why I was dreaming about a forest fire I hadn't heard of yet or how that happened. But as I said, when writers have questions, when fiction writers have questions, we write fiction to get to the answer. So I invented a person and gave him that dream, and then he figured out why he was having the dream, and anyway. So I got to go through this process of figuring out how Kevin had this family connection with the fire and what happened and exactly how the fire worked. And I'm one of those writers who everything has to be right unless I want to change it deliberately because I'm a fiction author. But if I'm not doing it deliberately, I want it really grounded in. In Ecological Memory, there is a scene where the characters are sitting on Mount Champlain, actually, on Mount Desert Island, and there's this ledge of rock, and you can see the ocean, and you can see Jackson Lab, and there's this ledge of rock, and there is a large patch of green map lichen on the rock there, the shape of a peanut, just right there. And they talk about it briefly and then go on to other things. It's like maybe a sentence about this lichen. That lichen is there, unless it's died since I was last visited, and I hope it hasn't because it's like 200 years old. it's a real lichen, and it's right there, and you can go there and tell you the kind of person Tom is. I mentioned this. I wanted for other reasons to write about a lichen there for a different story, and I said, okay, Tom, I need a lichen that, has these particular, it's about this age and, so forth. And he said, okay, I know the exact one you mean. And when we went for a hike, and he said, it's right over there. This is anyway, so that's the kind of naturalist he is, and this is the kind of writer I am. So I had to learn all about this stuff, this fire. And I'm going to read you a scene from this book talking about the fire itself, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the writing of that scene. I'm not going to tell you how Kevin had the dream. You got to read the book for that. But here, Kevin is a viewpoint character here. He has found this significant place, and he's, as the section begins, he is at this ruined site, and he's trying to imagine the garden that grew there. And then, as you'll see, it kind of segues into something else. What were in those beds besides blueberries and lily of the valley? Purple-flowered rhodora, surely, and also white-flowering Labrador tea, huckleberry, and sheep laurel, purple again, each arranged so that as one after another bloomed and faded, the whole remained visually balanced and lovely. Snowberry, crowberry, mountain cranberry, and crowbroom must have crept like green throw rugs over the stones that made up the bones of this place. The three-toothed cinquefoil and black chokeberry sprouted from the soil caught in the deliberately incompleted mortared joints between the stones. Multiple species of arcing fern fronds, crouching juniper bushes, dark-leaved withrod, young northern white cedars with their flat sprays of aromatic foliage, all provided contrast and enriched the visual texture of the whole. Slim shad trees provided color, white flowers against wine red spring foliage at the beginning of the growing season, while sugar maples did the same at the end. Rose had written extensively about the importance of painting with plants, not only in space but also in time, and for multiple audiences, for the human eye and also for the needs of mammals, birds, and insects, so they would have food, cover, and places to raise their young throughout the year. The multiple water features, mostly small, shallow pools, but also winding, intermittent streams, accommodated frogs, toads, salamanders, newts, turtles, and the nymphs of dragonflies. The gardener, Rose, painted with animals as well as with plants, in sound as well as color, aiming for frog song in May, fireflies in June, monarch butterflies in July, deer gambling through hoar-frosted grasses as autumn came on. From that house you could see all of it. From that brooding, simple yet grand wooden structure with a stone foundation, brick chimneys, and multiple porches, you could look out over the water gardens and the rock gardens and the deer-haunted meadows, look deep into the surrounding forests that largely screened the road from view, look out across the green and sloping land to the northeast, out to the blue and shining sea. Only the land wasn't green today, not all green. It was orange and yellow and brown and winter gray. The bare or autumnal deciduous trees peeking through, scattered among the dark pines and spruces because it was October. It is October. It is 1947. It is Thursday, between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. Half a dozen people are carrying armloads of things out of the house and packing them in a large station wagon. The wind has just changed. They can hear it, a rising gale out of the north, and they know what it means. Yet now they stand irresolute, each frozen in place by a different set of uncertainties. They can't all fit into the already loaded vehicle. To drive away to safety, they need Mrs. McCarthy to come back. She went to the post office to mail out a box of her most precious things. She's not back yet. And anyway, not everything the people had meant to take has been loaded. Should they abandon their employer's things and run? What about their own things? What about the house and the gardens and the woods, their own attachments and loyalties? Is anywhere going to be safe? Already they can smell the fire on the wind. Gravel Sprays is another car, an altogether nicer one, tears up the driveway, turns around in front of the garage, comes back, and brakes hard behind the house. "Drop everything, let's go," shouts Kathleen McCarthy before she's all the way out of her car. "Come on." "Dot won't come," says Mr. Stevens, coming out of the house. He and his wife are the only two in the group who don't work for Mrs. McCarthy, but are instead her dear friends. Dot is the maid. She is very young and doesn't think clearly when she's frightened. She has just run back into the house. Plainly, Mr. Stevens wants to be gallant and go in after her. There is no time. "Ugh," cries Mrs. McCarthy, exasperated. "You make sure everybody gets into the cars. I'll go get Dot." And she runs into the house. The others finish loading whatever they're carrying, but a few things don't fit and must stay. The people get in, Mr. Stevens at the wheel of one car, the other's driver's seat empty. But one woman, her arms full of botany texts and notebooks, still hasn't gotten in. The others are calling to her, but she ignores them. She looks around wildly. The trees, the shrubs, the sitting areas mowed into the grass, each one with its own wooden benches and tables, like favorite rooms. The fish, the poor little fish, the wind is carrying sparks now. Thick smoke, the column of it, unbelievably huge this close up, leans up over the house and blots out the sun. The others call again. She's not listening. Rose Stone stares in longing horror at her gardens, the closest thing to a child she and her dead husband will ever share. Mrs. McCarthy comes out of the house, pulling the weeping Dot by the hand. She shoves the girl into the car in the care of Mr. and Mrs. Stevens, who will make sure she doesn't get out again. Rose dumps her books into the footwell of the passenger seat of the other car as Mrs. McCarthy jumps in behind the wheel. "I can't go," Rose tells her employer, stammering but decisive. I need a minute. "Chris's garden. I'll meet you at the foot of the driveway." The two women look at each other. They are not of the same generation, and despite Rose's moneyed upbringing, they are not now of the same social class. And yet they are alike. "Hurry," Mrs. McCarthy tells her. "We'll wait as long as we can." Rose shuts the door and the cars speed off. She looks around one last time, and the roar of the coming fire fills her ears. It has crested the hill above her into the immediate north. She has seconds, she knows. Her eyes fall on the white oak, a field-grown tree, as out of place and as yet at home here as she is, her vegetative friend. She has always felt safe with him. She fights an urge to hug the trunk, to climb up into the spreading branches and hide. The tree explodes. When I first thought of that scene, it was entirely fiction. But as I said, I had all this research I wanted to do. I needed to know, I needed a part of town that burned in the fire, because not all of Bar Harbor did. I needed a part of town that burned during the fire and has since been allowed to revert to forest. It's part of the park now. And I needed to know where that was, because I needed what direction the fire moved through the site. You know, are these characters going to be, if they're facing the road, is the fire coming behind them, or is it coming towards them over the road? So I was looking over maps and descriptions of the fire, whatever, and I found this book, this amazing book, called Wildfire Loose, The Week Maine Burned. And it included some very detailed stories about this fire, and one of them, I believe the woman's name was Christine Rawlings, something like that. She owned the first home that burned on the outskirts of Bar Harbor that day. So it followed her story as she saw this fire coming. And I realized that not only was her location in the perfect, was her house in the perfect location for this scene, but also what actually happened there was very close to what I wanted the scene to do, including a gardener who didn't want to leave. So, you know, I changed names, I changed details, I, you know, added an exploding tree and some other things. But I had to go to that site, you know, I had to go see this real place. And I found it. It's part of the park now. It's not closed to visitors, but it's not open either. There's no way to find it unless you read the story. And I don't mean this story. I mean if you read Wildfire Loose carefully and put together things. And there's a couple of ruins there that I found. I found this one, and it matched the story exactly, so I'm sure that's what it is. And then I went back, and I brought Tom Wessels, who I told you about, and his thing is figuring out, doing site analysis of wild places, what has happened there, what changes have gone on over time. So I brought him back, and I brought my husband, who is a retired wildlands firefighter. He knows a thing or two about forest fires. And they analyzed the site for me, and I got to watch and listen in, and some of what they said actually became dialogue in the book. And it was this amazing privilege to be able to share in their expertise. It's a strange thing, being friends with an expert or being married to an expert doesn't make their expertise less cool. There's still this element of like, oh my goodness, they're letting me hear them do this. This is amazing. So that was one way that I felt just incredibly honored and privileged to be able to make this visit. But the other thing, just being there, other than things growing there, that site is the way that Mrs. Rawlings and the fire left it. Nobody's done anything. People went back and John D. Rockefeller Jr. hired people to cut down dead trees, and there are signs that that's their stumps. So that did happen, but it hasn't been rebuilt. It hasn't. It just is what it is. It felt like visiting a grave. Now, no humans died there that day. There were a few people, not many. There were a few people who died in that fire, but nobody there. But this was this woman's home. It was a summer home, but she loved that place, and she never went back. A home died there that day. And it was just an incredible privilege to be there. And that's one reason why I don't tell people where it is. If you can find it, you can find it, but you have to find it. It needs to be what it is. There are days that change the world forever. For a person, for a community, sometimes for the whole planet. And then you just live your life. Bifurcation events. Any questions?
No, I just love the way you write. I've not read either of the books, so.
Thank you. We are being recorded, and that means that there are people who will see this who don't get to ask me questions. So if you can think of, you too, if you can think of questions to ask for them, then feel free to speak up. Or, comments. If you have answers, feel free to provide those too.
How did you start off as a writer?
You did?
How did you start off as a writer?
Well, if you want to go back to the very beginning, somewhere in my mother's house are drawings I made with magic marker. And on those drawings, in my mother's handwriting, are bits of stories that I dictated to her. The drawings were illustrations for the stories in my head, and I could not write yet. So that's where it started. But when I was 11 or 12 years old, I realized two very important things about the adult world. One is that most adults don't take kindly to you talking about once you become adults, the other adults will no longer take kindly to your talking incessantly about your imaginary friends, unless you're a writer. The other thing that I realized is that writers get to do an awful lot of really cool stuff in the name of research. And I read some essays by Tim Cahill or Cahill. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. Anyway, he is amazing. And he wrote for Outside Magazine, and he's writing these stories about going scuba diving with sharks and learning how to hang glide and rock climb and cave dive and just all of this stuff so that he could write about it. And I thought, that sounds like a really cool job. So from that point on, I became obsessed with writing. It's like, I'm going to be a writer. This is what I'm going to do. And I paid a lot of attention to language and grammar and how these things fit together and how you could put together stories. And I have just been entirely obsessed with how to be a better writer since I was 11 years old. And I'm 47 now. And you work on something long enough, you get good at it. And this is what I did. I broke into print for the first time in my late teens. I had a poem published, and then I got essays published in my 20s. And I've been going full time as a freelance writer and editor since my early 30s. This is what I do. Anything else?
How can we get your book?
Well, today, you can come here and I can sell you copies. And I can't take credit cards, but I can take cash, and I can sign them for you. I have a pen in my pocket all ready for this very occasion.
Anticipating
Yes.
the sale of some books.
Hoping, actually.
Yeah.
I did a event last night and nobody bought anything. Maybe they went home and got an ebook.
For the people watching on TV, how do they buy your book? Is it on Amazon?
Thank you, I got sidetracked. It is on Amazon.
Is there a direct link to you? Do you have like a website?
Yes, I have a website, newsfromcaroline.wordpress. Whatever it is, com, I guess. And there I post, news about my writing and also whatever writerly things stuck. I just read this book and it was really bad, and here's why it was bad.
Oh, yeah.
But actually, I don't read bad books. I criticize really good books. And so I have a blog there with information on my thing. So yes, and that has links. You can also go to my publisher's website, Saltwater Media. So they have me there. They have also a lot of other authors there. There are a few brick and mortar stores that have my stuff. There are a few libraries that have my stuff. I suspect this one does or will. But if you decide, if you have a library, if you have a bookstore that you really like, and they don't carry my book, you can go to them and they say, there's this really awesome book and I want you to carry it, and you order it for me and you get my book, and maybe they'll get another one and somebody else will buy it, and it's cool. So you can do that too. Lots of options. And
Are you local? Are you from around here?
Oh, no. I live in Maryland.
I just looked up Saltwater Media and it said Maryland, so
Yeah.
that's what I thought.
Yeah. I live in Maryland. you imagine where I live. Forest, corn and soybean fields, ocean, my house. Yes, yeah, it is nice. People don't talk about how gorgeous soybean fields are in the fall. They get these like streaks of gold going through them, and then the gold gets deeper and eventually turns into like the framing of old photographs, of old paintings is it's just gorgeous, and nobody talks about the gorgeousness of soybean fields. Anyway. So that's where I live. I'm from Delaware originally, and I'm spending the summer, my husband and I camp host in Acadia National Park.
Oh, cool. So what made you think of putting Luke in Montreal?
Well, Luke is the sort of bad boy ne'er-do-well uncle of Andy, one of my two protagonists from Ecological Memory and Bifurcation events. And, you know, I was just thinking about what Andy's family is like, where he comes from, what his backstory is. And I was writing up some notes on his relatives. And Andy his last name is Cote. Andy Cote. And I know that's not how you pronounce the name Cote usually in New England. It's usually Cote or Cody here. But the last name came from one of my high school science teachers, and he pronounced it Cote. So it's Andy Cote. And it's a French-Canadian name. And so I thought, well, okay, maybe Andy has French-Canadian ancestry. What's that like? What are his relatives what are they doing? So I looked up the name, and I found out that there's this history of the Cotes in Montreal. So, and then Luke kind of grew out of that, and the more I worked on this backstory, the more I realized that Luke was this amazing character, and I needed to write about him. So that's how that happened. Anybody else?
What brings you to, go ahead.
Oh, you go.
What brings you to this area of southeastern Massachusetts?
You people do. I contacted a bunch of libraries, and I was looking for a place where multiple libraries within relatively easy driving distance of each other would all show interest in hosting me. And Southeastern Massachusetts did it, so I was able to schedule 3 events in 1 week.
Oh, cool. That works out.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is an awesome library.
This is such an awesome library, and I spent most of my adolescence in Western Massachusetts, but I never got east before, so I've never been to this area before, and I want to come back.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, what's the worst book you've ever read?
Worst book I've ever read. Well, there's one I threw across the room. It was, little teeny thing. It was a book about how to kiss. It's all about kissing. And different kinds of kisses and how to do different kinds of kisses and the names of the cute little book. But it was written some time ago. And I got to the part where the author was busy explaining that in order for the kiss to work, that the man must be taller than the woman or he cannot dominate her. And that's when the book went from.
That's good.
But most of the books I criticize in my blog are actually books that I really like because, if I throw a book across the room and don't pick it up again, I don't really know how it ends. But if I like a book and I read it many, many times and I think about it very carefully and I end up finding things in it that, well, this is a great book, except this one part over here, and isn't that interesting? And why did this happen? And why don't I like it? And then there's a blog post. Yeah, this. If that's about it, then
Good.
thanks for coming.
Awesome. A round of applause for Carolyn.